Hi everyone, I'm Matthew, and I am here to talk to you about landmarks, as it says there. But I wanted to start with a couple of questions that visitors to our sites might have. The first one is, what's on the page? And the second one is, how can I get there? Now, historically, headings have been a very popular method for getting around web pages. And when web pages looked a bit simpler, like this one, this is the Extremely Reliable Operating System web page. It was a research project, and it's a classic sort of computer science style web page. It's got headings, it's got links, it's got text, and nothing else. Now, it's quite easy if you're a visually browsing user to see your way around this page. You can see that there's three main headings, and if you are a visually browsing sort of person, you can use the up arrow, the down arrow, and the tab key to move around, and you can see the headings as they go past. If you happen to be using a screen reader, maybe you can't see the page so well, you can bring up a list of headings that might be on the page. This is an example of the sort of dialogue that would contain that information. There's also shortcut keys that screen readers provide for moving between headings. So that's all very simple and effective and efficient, but sites have evolved since then in a number of different ways. First of all, they've evolved in terms of the sophistication of the visual design of the site. This is the Paciello group's homepage. That's my employer. I work with the Paciello group, and we do accessibility stuff. So if you need any accessibility bits and bobs doing, please say hello. This is still a very simple page. It's got some main content in the middle. There's some links at the top. There's a footer at the bottom. And if it only had headings alone, it probably still would be quite easy to navigate because it's a simple page. But the design of this draws your attention to the middle and to the bits that are most important. And so it would be nice if perhaps there was some way of conveying that sort of feeling and that design to people who might not be able to appreciate it visually. This is a partial screen grab of a long and detailed and very interesting Wikipedia article about color perception deficit, or sometimes known as color blindness. And you're not supposed to be able to see this, but there's lots of images, there's lots of text, there's lots of headings there, and it makes perfect sense for it to be so many headings because it's a big detailed article. This is a sum of the headings, the heading tree of that particular article as reported by a screen reader. And there's a lot of detail in there, and that's great because the heading structure matches what you see on the page. But if we were to zoom in a little bit and just look at the top of the page where the beginning of the article is, then we can actually see that there's some other areas on the page as well. There's something up in the top right, which is there's a search box there, and there's some other links about user accounts and the history of a document. And then on the left-hand side, there's a navigation bar, and that's got lots of links in it that seem to be quite clearly from the visual design to do with Wikipedia rather than this particular article. So again, there's some information coming from the visuals there that might not be apparent from just looking at the heading structure. Of course, we do a lot more things online these days. We do online shopping, and we also use online communication tools. Some people use email clients, calendars and stuff, and all within the browser. This particular screenshot happens to be of Google Wave, because I still miss it. There could well be headings on here, but there's lots of different panes, user interface type panes, and list of messages and message content. So headings might not be quite enough just for this as well. So There's another thing that came around fairly quickly and has been with us for a while. It's a technique called skip links. Now, skip links work like this. You might go to a web page. This is a story on the BBC sports website. It's got interesting statistics about marathons, because that's a topical thing at the moment. And if you are browsing with the keyboard, the first time you press tab on the keyboard, up pops a skip link, and this takes you to the main content of the page. And when you follow the skip link, you get whooshed down the page to the main content. Now, that can save you a lot of time, depending on how much you get to skip over. Skip links are awesome. They are easily discoverable because the convention is they're pretty much the first thing on the page, so they're easy to find. They allow you to avoid content that's repeated on many pages, and that could add up to quite a lot of content, and it saves the visitors of your site a lot of time. Now, the first time they visit the site, they might well want to explore it fully, but when they've come to your site for the 10th time and they know where they're going, being able to skip over that stuff is really, really useful. I'll just give a brief demonstration of how long it might take to skip over that content if it weren't for the fact that this site already has good skip links and headings. Just give you a quick idea of how noisy that can be. So turn on VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on Safari. London Marathon 2019. You shrink how much 7. Heading level 2. Link.
So I'm going
Link.
to go
Sign
through
in.
some links.
Link. BBC. Link. Link. Sport. Link. 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 End search. You search the BBC.
Well, that
You are
sounds
currently
useful,
on a
but
text
I want
element.
to skip it.
Search end of beat banner. Link. End navig. Link. 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 Link.
Still saying link,
Athletics.
so I'll just
You
carry
are
on
currently
going.
end of navig. Link. 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 End of navigation. Main. You are currently on a main. Heading level 1. London Marathon 2019. You shrink how much 7 stats to make you go wow. You are currently
Okay,
VoiceOver
so
off.
that's how long it might take. Now, all of that navigational stuff is actually really good, and it's very well marked up, which is why I showed you on this site, because they've done a very good job with allowing you to skip things if you want to. But just imagine if you couldn't do that, and if you had to go through all that sort of thing every time, it could get annoying. So, skip links are awesome, but they do have some disadvantages or potential traps. One of them is that they only appear where the author has put them. So usually they're at the top because you start off at the top, and that's the most likely place you'll be when you want to skip over something repetitive, but you might be somewhere else on the page. They only go to the places where the authors have provided them for. So if it might say skip to content, but if you wanted to skip to something else, you might be stuck. And also in complex app-like settings, they might not be so useful. If you're using a web-based email program and you've got a list of messages on one side and you've got message content on the other, you might want to switch between those two quite a lot, but that would be difficult with skip links. And equally, you might have a search results for shopping items on one side and your shopping basket on the other. You might want to switch between the two. So again, skip links have some limits as to where they can be useful. So now we've got a new thing called landmark regions. What are landmark regions? Well, they're signposts to different areas of the page that might be useful, and we're talking about broad areas of the page. The key thing about landmarks is they are non-visual. You can't actually see the landmark, but that's by design because it's supposed to be a complement to the visual design that you've already got on your page. And the key thing is that they are designed to facilitate random access between different regions of the page. So solving the problem of skip links, they're kind of like universal skip links, if you will. And they came about through the World Wide Web Consortium's Accessible Rich Internet Application, or ARIA, standards. That's where they were specified. And we've had them for quite a while now, and the support for them is very good. So just going back to the Paciello group home page, the landmarks on that page would call out things like, there's navigation up here, this is the main content in the middle, oh, and this stuff at the bottom is probably contact information and other supporting links. And this is all the stuff that the visual design is telling you already, so this is the semantic counterpart to that. If we take a look at how a screen reader might report that, there's a tree here of landmarks. We see that there's one called banner, there's navigation, there's main, which is the main content, and then there's another one called content information, which corresponds to the footer. So that's all very nice and easy to navigate. So as a developer, how do you provide landmarks to your users? Well, it's quite easy. Let's have a look at a good example so far is a search box, because that's quite a common activity that people will want to do. You might already have a text box and a button that together form your search functionality as far as the user is concerned. And you might have those grouped in a div or even a field set or something else like that. So if you wanted to highlight this as a search landmark, all you do is add a role attribute and set its value to search. And that says, I'm the search functionality on this page. So let's try the classic one, main content. Back when my colleague Steve Faulkner was researching how people put together web pages for seeing about introducing the main element, what he found was that loads of people have something like this: div ID equals content, or div ID equals main, or maybe it's got a class of content or a class of main. And in those cases, what you can do to say this is a main landmark is you can just put role equals main on there, and then that becomes the main landmark on the page. Now, this has got ID of main and role of main, and programmers generally don't like repetition. And as it goes with Immortals from Highlander, there can only be one main. So you don't need the ID if you want to be brave or just obsessive about not repeating yourself. So you can just have div role equals main. But as Marcy's talk alluded to, and in fact demonstrated, things have got even easier than this. HTML5 brought loads of elements that bring with them landmark roles. So you can actually just have a main element. Couldn't be easier than that. So simple. Actually, it's not quite true that there can only be one or there must only be one. You can have more than one main element as long as the other ones are invisible. So that wasn't quite true. Anyway, so main content. Div role equals main is exactly the same semantically as main. And it's very similar for other elements like footer. You might have a div with a class of footer. You could give it a role of content info instead. That's the landmark that corresponds to footer. Or you could just give it a footer element and it will provide that role for you. And HTML5, as I say, brings these landmark roles automatically. So it's a bit of auto-magicalness provided by HTML there. If you use any of these elements, then you get the landmark roles for free, with some caveats, but actually they're really helpful ones, as we'll see. So header is the header, nav corresponds to navigation, then you've got main, you've got section, form, aside is complementary, and footer is content info. But there's some helpful caveats here. The first one is that if you've got a header or a footer, they're only counted as landmarks if they're the page global ones. So it stops you from having multiple landmarks when you may not have meant to. And also, if you've got a section element or a form element, the only ones of those that will be counted as landmarks are ones that have an explicit label. The reason being, you don't want to be too noisy with your landmarks. So a section element on its own with some content is not a landmark, but if you put a heading in that section and you associated the heading as the section's label by using something like ARIA-labeled by, pointing to the ID of the header, then that is labeled and then that will become a landmark. So there's some golden rules about landmarks. The first one is landmarks are for an overview of the content on the page, but headings are for the fine-grained navigation. So they're doing different things. If we go back to that example of the Wikipedia article, then the landmarks are going to broadly say something like search is up in the top. It's not spatial, but search is there. Main content is also available, and some navigation is available. Now, in actual fact, on Wikipedia, there are more than 3 landmark regions because there's different types of navigation, and there's more than just search at the top. But there are generally not that many landmarks, especially when you compare it to the number of headings that are in a substantial article like this. So expect to have fewer landmarks than headings for sure. I mean, this is quite an extreme example. Another one is try and use relatively few landmarks but cover all the content on the page. And again, Axe will warn you about this, as Marcy said in her talk. The covering all the content on the page is generally just so that things are neat. And using the fewest number of landmarks as you can is a good idea because you want to quickly give the user an overview of what's on the page. And if you've got more than one of the same type of landmark, then it's a really good idea to differentiate them by using labels. So if I have a page with 2 nav elements on, that's 2 navigation regions, I don't actually know what the difference is between those unless I look inside them, but that defeats the object of the overview. So I could give them labels. I've used ARIA-label here, which imparts an invisible label. And I've called one of them site and one of them page. So we know that one of them is about navigation around the site and one is about navigation on the current page. It would have been better, though, if I'd have used visible headings and ARIA-labeled by, as I mentioned earlier, and there might be an example of that coming up. One more thing, there's no need to mention the type of the landmark in the label. If you were to say site as the label for this navigation region, then a screen reader is almost certainly going to say site navigation. Those are the default settings for most screen readers. So if you were to say site navigation as the label, you'd actually hear site navigation, navigation, which is not what you want. But I said landmarks are great, you know, they could help everybody. I think we're missing something here. What about keyboard users? Now, I couldn't actually find a computer keyboard picture that was like really cool, so this is a musical keyboard. But what about keyboard users? And you know what? What about mouse users as well? That's just a cute fluffy mouse, because why not? So there is a landmarks extension, which I didn't originally write. It was David Todd from IBM back in the Firefox days, Firefox original format of extensions, before HTML5. My colleague Steve Faulkner suggested that I update it to support the HTML5 landmarks, and so I did, and the Paciello group generously donated that development time. And then web extensions came along, and I rewrote it so that it works on different browsers, and took it on as a pet project. So I'll just show you an example of it in use. Actually, I'm going to struggle because I haven't installed it on this machine. If anybody's got the Wi-Fi, if anybody could help me with the Wi-Fi whilst we are, I could do some questions perhaps. If I could connect to the Wi-Fi, I could install it.
I'll give you a hotspot.
Yeah. Apologies. If anybody's got any questions about it now whilst we're fiddling about with this, then...
I'll give you a question and I'll try and set this up for you. So, is there a danger of adding too many navigation landmarks to a page, for example, primary and secondary navs and breadcrumbs and footer navs? Too much? Question mark.
There is, and that's why it's really important to differentiate between them. And I'd love to show you an example of doing that if I can get this. Yeah. So if you have more than one of the same type of landmark, then you do run the risk of providing too much information. You want to give a quick overview to people. So there is a danger of that, but sometimes there are legitimate reasons why you would need to provide so many landmarks, which is why I haven't given you any hard numbers in this, because it does depend. So I'm just going to quickly switch back to this. I'm going to go and find the browser extension. I'm going to add it. I know where the button is, fortunately. I believe it's doing its trick.
I think it is.
It's a really small extension as well. It's only about 30K. So one of the things that... oh, it's almost here. So the first thing that happens is you get an overview of landmarks in this pop-up over here. You can use the keyboard to move between. We've got a banner, we've got navigation, we can skip straight to the main element, and we've also got this footer element at the bottom. Okay, so there's also a sidebar which can be used, and you can toggle all of the landmarks. So I just want to show you a very quick example. That was what it's like for a user, but it's got some developer tools in it as well. And I just want to very quickly show you an example of that. So here is a web page that I made copying from Wikipedia about wombats, and you can see that there's lots of different landmarks in here, and it's all very neat. But there are two navigation landmarks, and they are both called navigation. So what you can do is you can fire up the developer tools to figure out what's going on here. There's a magnifier there which takes you to the element that is relevant here. So that's the main site navigation. And what I want to do is associate the World of Wombats site title that's visually next to it with the actual navigation region. So I'm going to add an attribute, an ID equals site title. Did I spell site title correctly? And then I'm going to add ARIA labeled by site title. And then you may have noticed in the sidebar there it changed. And then it's always useful when you are doing these things to do it visually for everybody. So I'm going to go into here. I'm going to edit this as HTML. I'm going to put a paragraph in. So I've put on this page, and then I'm going to go back and find that navigation landmark. I'm going to add an attribute. And we see that now we've got on this page navigation. I'll just close the DevTools. And you can see that those labels are reflected. So if you're a developer, you can now visualize what the landmarks are on the page and what your users will get. And if you're a user who uses the keyboard or the mouse, you can see how many landmarks there are on the page and benefit from landmarks like screen reader users can. And that is about it. I will turn it over immediately to questions.
Thank you very much, Matt. I like the wombat example. It's very cute. So a couple of questions on the website. Is it safe to not use the role attribute as well as HTML5 elements? Which browsers don't support the HTML5 landmark roles?
Support for landmark roles is really, really good in both browsers and in assistive technologies. It used to be the case that we would recommend that you put main role equals main. It still can help people who are maybe using older versions of assistive technologies, so it doesn't hurt at all to do that because you're just giving it the role that it should get automatically anyway. So there could still be a case for doing that in order to support people who don't have the latest assistive technologies, but that won't be the case forever.
Okay, and then are landmarks useful for drag and dictate users?
Oh, yes. Landmarks are useful for everyone. Trying to get back to my slides, and I can't, but there was only one that said, thanks for listening, any questions? So, and acknowledgements, which you'll have to look at later. So, yeah, landmarks can be very useful for people who want to use their voice to get around the page as well. That's a brilliant question.
Okay, that's it. Raf, anyone in the audience? Yep. See you.
Hiya, great talk, Matthew. Do you know what support is like for landmarks using when you've got a website in a different language other than English?
In terms of, well, the roles are standardized. I don't know, I mean, if the labels that you provide could be localized, but the roles themselves are standard. Now, I've not used different locales, so I'm not entirely sure, but I don't see why they couldn't be presented differently. I mean, if I did a translation of this into a different language, it would see content info, but it would probably say the appropriate word in that language. So I think, I hope that would be a user interface level problem, so therefore quite easily solvable.
Okay, thank you. Actually, one other question, if I may. You said Dragon users can use landmarks. Do you mean with the add-on that you've got there, or without?
This is focused on keyboard users, so there isn't anything specifically in here for Dragon, but my understanding is that it supports landmark roles. Hopefully that's right.
Cool, yeah. I guess I was just wondering how the user would know that they were there.
Well, this is a problem with landmarks, is being invisible. I mean, I guess you could, if you just hoped there was a main region, you could say, go to the main region. But yeah, it needs them to be exposed. So I suppose this may well help. I haven't actually tried this with Dragon. I will go away and do so.
Thank you.
So I spent quite a bit of effort prepping a nice, clean presentation environment with no notifications and got my clicker working and everything, and then realized browser profile has been reset. So
I
That was
have
a lesson.
one last question. The extension that you did, it does cover both the role and the actual HTML tags, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it doesn't differentiate both in the names that it provides, does it?
So if a label is provided, it will show you the label first. So in this case,
No, I mean for the role, like if it is made by a div with a role, it's not going to mention it, is it?
it will show up divs or other elements that have been given landmark roles, yes.
Okay.
It's not just HTML5.
Okay.
Okay.
Hi, Matthew. I'm Graham. Is there guidance or a recipe or something that would help use landmarks within an application type site? So if you've got groups of buttons that do something, or a way of helping the user navigate around a complex application page as opposed to a content page?
There are some general things like, so if it's an email application and you've got a list of messages and you've got the message content and then you've got navigation above that, then those sound like separate landmarks. So you might have a labeled section element for the list of messages, and you might have another region for the message content, and then you might have your navigation at the top and probably a footer and maybe a banner. If it's that sort of thing, you don't need too many, because within one of those regions you can use headings to navigate and other techniques, but that's just one example. Probably could talk to you about other ones afterwards.
Thank you.
Hello. Would you ever landmark to an invisible area, like say that you wanted navigation specific to people who, who needed assistive technology, didn't navigate? So I'm just thinking of the on the page section. Would you, is it meant to point to visible navigation always, or just, can it be other technologies as well, visible?
I think it's dangerous in general. I think it could be dangerous to have a big chunk of content that is hidden from a large group of users. I understand that, for example, you might want to hide decorative icons from screen reader users. In some cases, you do see things that are visually hidden for screen readers specifically, and that can have a use. But generally, I think if there was so much content that you were thinking of surrounding it in a landmark and it wasn't visible, that might raise some warning bells that maybe that's not necessarily an appropriate pattern. I mean, there could be cases, but generally, if you're going to hide that much that it would go in a landmark, I'd be wanting to look at the reasons behind that.
Thank you.
Just do one more, Ruff. Yeah. Yeah, it's I hear that in front.
Hiya. Do assistive technology users have a way of actually discovering what landmarks are available through the interface of the assistive technology itself? If not, or perhaps in addition to that, might you recommend putting that information like on the accessibility statement or in some help documentation or somewhere on the page?
Generally, if somebody's using a screen reader or maybe a screen magnifier or some specific assistive technology, they have access to this information. And the imbalance was actually that if you're a keyboard-only user or just anybody else who might find this useful, it wasn't available, but it is in there. So the idea of this was to expose that. Hopefully, eventually, browsers will expose it to everybody, so you wouldn't need to be explicit about it, because it'd just be like, it'd become like skip links, it'd just be expected. But at the moment, it generally, unless you've got an extension like this one, and there are others, you wouldn't know about it if you didn't have an assistive technology. So it could still be at the stage, even amongst assistive technology users, of needing some awareness raising. But I think landmarks have been out for about 7 or 8 years now, so the support and the awareness is building and has built up quite well.
I guess I'm thinking of any sort of non-standard ones, for a particular application, maybe if you've labelled it manually, kind of thing.
The great thing about landmark regions are that they are standard, so it's really good to stick to the standard ones. But if you can't, because you need to convey this is an important region, like it's my list of messages or it's my email, you can use a section and label it or other means. And that wouldn't be standard, but it would still be useful. None of them would be discoverable unless you used something like this or an assistive technology. But if you did use one of these, you would automatically get that information. So you can specify a custom landmark region and it would show up in here or assistive technologies.
Thank you.
Okay, Matthew, thank you so much. A round of applause, please.
Thanks for listening.